Laura's going to demonstrate how to do elbow flexion active range of motion. So to start, she's going to make sure that the client's feet are flat on the floor, and then she's going to palpate for the lateral epicondyle of the humerus, which you're going to see right now, and that's where the axis of the goniometer is going to be placed. The stationary arm is going to run parallel along the humerus, and then the movable arm is going to run parallel along the radius. You're going to have the client put their palm forward, and then you're going to ask them to touch their shoulder, and then you will move the movable arm along with that radius as it moves up, and then readjust as needed. She measured 141, and typical range of motion for elbow flexion is 150. So Laura's going to demonstrate how to do elbow flexion passive range of motion. So same thing applies. You want the client's feet flat on the floor. You want the axis on the lateral epicondyle of the humerus, the stationary arm parallel with the humerus, and the movable arm parallel with the radius. You'll want to wrap your hand around the movable arm and kind of wrap around that distal aspect of the forearm, pushing and supporting on the way up. And then you're going to adjust as needed, and she measured me at 145, which is a little bit higher, which is what we would expect, and typical range of motion is 150 for elbow flexion. So I'm going to demonstrate how to do elbow extension active range of motion. So you want the client's feet flat on the floor, and I'm going to line up everything the same. I want my axis on that lateral epicondyle of the humerus, and then my stationary arm parallel to the humerus and my movable arm parallel to the radius. You're going to start with them in a flex position so that way you can assess their full range of motion as they extend their elbow. So this is just me lining everything up, and then Maddie's extending her arm right there. And then you also want to make sure that their palm is facing forward when they are extended. And then I'm just repalpating to make sure I'm on that lateral epicondyle and humerus. And then typical range of motion for elbow extension is 0 degrees, which is what I got as well. And then I'm measuring that top part, which I'm going to point to in a second, of that goniometer right there, which is 0 degrees. So the same principles apply for elbow extension passive range of motion. You want the client's feet flat on the floor, and then ideally you would measure this after you do elbow flexion passive range of motion. So we're going to start in a flex position. My axis is going to be on that lateral epicondyle of the humerus, my stationary arm is going to be parallel with the humerus, and my movable arm is going to be parallel on the radius. And I'm just going to support the distal forearm and wrist on the descent so that way it doesn't flop down. And then you can see I kind of switched to an overhand grip. This can be important if a client is not reaching full extension, so that way you can push a little bit farther and see if you can get them to 0 degrees. And this is just me lining up everything again to make sure that I have it correct. And I got 0 degrees of elbow extension, which is normal range. And then Maddie's going to demonstrate how to do elbow flexion manual muscle testing against gravity. So you want the client's feet flat on the floor, you want to assess their full range of motion, which she did right there, and then you're going to place them in 50% of that range of motion or the test position. You're going to support that distal aspect of the humerus and then apply pressure onto the distal aspect of the forearm, not crossing that wrist joint. And then she measured me at a 5 because I withstood max pressure, and then also make sure that the client's hand is supinated. And then Maddie's going to demonstrate how to do elbow extension manual muscle testing against gravity. So you want the client in supine or laying on their back, and then you want them to raise their arms straight up to assess their range of motion. So they'll go into flexion and then extension, so straightening out that elbow. And then you're going to place them in 50% of that range of motion, and then you'll support the distal aspect of the humerus, and then you'll apply pressure on the distal aspect of the forearm, making sure that their palm is facing the floor. And then she rated me a 5 because I withstood max pressure. And then Maddie's going to demonstrate how to do elbow flexion manual muscle testing in a minimized gravity position. So you want the client's feet flat on the floor, and you want a table raised up so that way their arm is abducted, and you want a good straight level so that way the shoulder isn't falling too far down or too far up. You're going to assess their range of motion in flexion, kind of supporting that wrist, that way it doesn't fall down when it crosses over the table. And then you're going to place them in 50% of that range of motion, supporting the distal aspect of the humerus, and you're going to apply pressure on the distal aspect of the forearm into extension. She rated me a 2+ because I withstood slight pressure. And then also for a level 1 and 0, you're going to palpate the biceps brachii. And then finally, Maddie is going to demonstrate how to do elbow extension manual muscle testing in a minimized gravity position. So same thing, you want the client's feet flat on the floor and a table so that way the shoulder is abducted, making sure that line is straight. And then you're going to assess the client's range of motion through full extension, making sure to support that wrist, that way it doesn't droop off the table. And then you're going to place them in 50% of range of motion. For that test position, you're going to support the distal aspect of the humerus, and you're going to apply pressure into elbow flexion to measure extension. And then she rated me 2+ because I withstood that slight pressure. And then for a level 1 and 0, you're going to palpate the triceps. And then I just want to discuss some compensations that you need to be on the lookout for. So you always want to make sure when you're doing goniometry for elbow flexion and extension that their arm is adducted, and you want that elbow tucked at the side. If they flare their elbow out, it can mess up the reading. So just always make sure that they have that arm against their side.